Get your filthy hands off, my son. Victoria Montgomery's scream echoed through the grand hall, louder than the thunder crashing outside. Her sparkling necklace shook against her expensive dress as she stepped forward, fury burning in her eyes. But Evelyn Brooks, the 50-year-old maid who had quietly worked in this house for over 10 years, didn't let go. Her arms held the weak body of Richard Montgomery, the 31-year-old billionaire who owned a huge empire from Los Angeles to New York. His chest heaved, his breathing shallow, as if life itself was slipping away. "Call 911, shouted Daniel, the eldest son, rushing to grab his phone. Claire, the daughter, stood frozen by the stairs, her face pale in fear. The staff waited quietly by the corridor, unsure what to do. Victoria's voice cut through the room again, full of rage. "You're killing him! Let go of him!" But Evelyn's grip only tightened. Her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered in Richard's ear, words meant only for him. "You are my son." The room stood frozen in silence. Richard's shallow breath was the only sound, echoing like a distant memory. His body twitched, weak and fragile, as Evelyn continued to hold him in her arms, her grip unyielding. The storm outside roared in fury, but inside the Montgomery mansion, the tension was more intense than any thunder. Victoria Montgomery's eyes burned with fury as she stood a few steps away, her hands clenched into tight fists. "Get your hands off him, you worthless woman!" she screamed, her voice sharp, filled with venom. "You're killing him! Step aside!" But Evelyn didn't move. Her eyes were locked on Richard's face, her arms gently cradling him as she whispered to him in a voice so soft only he could hear. "You are my son." The words hung heavy in the air. It felt as if the world itself held its breath. Daniel, the eldest son, looked from his father to Evelyn, his phone still in his hand, frozen in disbelief. The staff stood on the edges of the room, watching with wide eyes, unsure of what to do. Claire, the daughter, stood still, her face pale and her body trembling. She couldn't process what was happening. The truth, so sudden, was more than her mind could handle. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she moved closer. "Step aside, Evelyn. You've done enough damage," she hissed. "You don't belong here. You never did." But Evelyn remained firm, her body shaking with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered softly to Richard, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm here for you, always." The sound of sirens filled the air, drawing nearer, signaling the arrival of help. The private ambulance, shrieking up the driveway, broke the tense silence. The paramedics rushed inside, pushing past the frozen staff, their expressions uncertain. They moved swiftly to Richard, lifting him onto a stretcher, his lips trembling as the oxygen hissed by his side. Evelyn tried to take a step closer, her eyes filled with desperate hope, but Victoria's voice cut through the air. "Stay back, Evelyn. You've done enough damage. You've lied to him. You've ruined everything." Her words were venomous, but Evelyn didn't let them affect her. Her heart ached with years of secrets and sacrifice, but she couldn't turn back now. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it was. Daniel stood still, his expression caught between confusion and disbelief. Why would she say that? His voice was shaky, unsure of what to believe. His eyes locked onto Evelyn, trying to make sense of her words, her actions. Claire stayed silent, her eyes wide, still processing the words she had heard. She felt an overwhelming storm brewing inside her. Could this really be true? Was Evelyn truly Richard's mother? Inside the ambulance, Evelyn sat quietly, her hands clasped together, trembling. She stared out the window, her thoughts consumed by everything that had just happened. Rain streaked down the glass, each drop a reminder of the secret she had carried for so long. She whispered a silent prayer, hoping that Richard would survive long enough to understand the truth. Across from her, Victoria leaned in close to Daniel, her voice low and filled with suspicion. "Don't listen to her lies. She's just after his money. That's all this is." But Evelyn's gaze never left Richard's pale face. A single tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered under her breath, "Please, Lord, let him live long enough to know the truth." As the ambulance made its way toward the hospital, Richard's hand twitched faintly. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment it seemed as though he was trying to fight his body's failing strength. His lips parted, rasping through the oxygen mask, his voice hoarse and barely audible. What did she whisper?" The question hung heavy in the air, the words slicing through the tension like a knife. Every eye turned toward Evelyn, her body rigid with the weight of her secret. Her hands trembled as she clutched them tightly together, her heart pounding in her chest. The private wing of St. Matthew's Medical Center buzzed with activity. Machines beeped steadily, their sounds echoing in the sterile, antiseptic-filled air. Richard Montgomery lay propped against white pillows, his skin pale and drawn. His eyes flickered, weak, but there was a spark of recognition buried deep within them, a shadow of something he couldn't fully grasp. Around his bed the family stood, silent and filled with fear. Victoria, the ever-precious wife, was there. Daniel, the oldest son, stood near the bed with his arms crossed. Claire, the daughter, sat on the other side, holding back tears. And at the far corner of the room stood Evelyn, her maid's uniform still stained from the storm outside, her body slightly bent as if holding onto every ounce of strength she had left. Richard's voice was weak, but it carried with it the sharpness of authority, something that had once commanded boardrooms and business deals. "What did she whisper to me?" he asked again, his eyes darting between his mother and the maid. The question seemed to freeze the air, making everyone hold their breath, waiting for the answer. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice dripping with false concern. "Darling, don't strain yourself," she said, her tone honeyed but insincere. "The maid was hysterical. You were fainting. She just babbled nonsense." She turned sharply to Evelyn. "Tell him you were confused. Tell him you were wrong." Evelyn's hands twisted together, trembling with fear and anxiety, but her eyes met Richard's. "No, sir," she said softly, but with absolute clarity. "I meant every word." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between his father and Evelyn. "Father," he said, his voice cracked, "she said something about being your mother?" Richard's chest rose and fell rapidly, his hand gripping the blanket as though he were holding onto something fragile, something that could slip away in an instant. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes searching her face for answers, for something to make sense of this confusion that gripped him. "Is it true?" Richard's voice cracked. He could barely breathe, but he had to know. "Answer me, Evelyn. Are you my mother?" Evelyn's body trembled as she stood by the bed. The years of silence, the pain of being close but never truly seen, all came crashing down. She had carried this secret for so long, and now, with Richard's life hanging in the balance, there was no more room for silence. She finally allowed herself to speak the truth. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Yes." The room fell still. Even the machine seemed to quiet, their beeps fading under the weight of Evelyn's words. She stood tall, her hands shaking, but her voice carried a sense of dignity. She repeated herself, her words stronger this time. "Yes, Richard, you are my son." Victoria's voice cut through the silence, harsh and mocking.
"Lies," she scoffed, her eyes filled with contempt. "You're just trying to manipulate him. She's nothing but a maid, a servant trying to destroy everything." But Evelyn's gaze never wavered from Richard's face. "I was 19, alone, poor. The man who fathered you left me the moment I told him I was pregnant. I had nothing, not even a roof over my head. For days, I held you close, praying you would survive." Richard's fingers tightened around the blanket. His mind couldn't fully process the weight of her words, but his heart ached with something more than just confusion. He could feel it, the ache of years of missed love and truth. Evelyn continued, her voice cracking, but she pressed on, telling the story she had kept buried for so long. "One night, in the pouring rain, I brought you here. I placed you on the doorstep, wrapped in my only blanket. I rang the bell and hid in the shadows, praying someone would take you in." Richard's breath hitched, the pieces slowly falling into place. "I came back 2 days later," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. "Not to take you back, but to beg for work. I thought if I could serve here, I could be near you. Even if you never knew me, I could watch you grow. That would be enough."
Why didn't you tell me? Richard's voice cracked, the pain of a lifetime of lies suffocating him. His hand hovered near Evelyn, desperate to find answers. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she held his gaze. "Because I loved you more than myself," she whispered softly. "I stayed silent because it was the only way I could stay near you. Every day I watched you grow, from a baby to the man you are now. I never wanted anything in return, just to be close to you, to know you were safe." Her words broke him. He had never known this side of her, never realized the depth of her sacrifice. It felt as though the floor had been ripped out from beneath him. Victoria's voice, sharp and desperate, interrupted the moment. "You can't be serious, Richard," she screamed. "She's just a servant. She's lying. She's trying to destroy everything." Her voice trembled with fear and anger. But Richard didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on Evelyn. "No, you don't get to say that anymore," he said, his voice strong. "You raised me with lies. You raised me in shadows I never knew existed." Daniel stepped forward, his voice unsure but filled with a growing sense of understanding. "Father, I don't know what to think, but she knew things no one else could know." Richard's hand rose, silencing his son. "I owe my life to her," he said softly, looking at Evelyn with tears in his eyes. "She's my mother. You just gave me lies." The family stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what had just been revealed. Richard turned back to Evelyn, his voice breaking. "I will honor you, Evelyn. I will never turn my back on the truth again." Evelyn's tears flowed freely now, but her eyes shone with a deep, unshakable love. She reached out, taking his hand. "Thank you, Richard. Thank you for finally seeing the truth." The grand mansion stood tall under the clear sky, its marble steps glowing like freshly washed stones after the storm. But inside, the air felt heavy. News of the truth had spread like wildfire across the estate, reaching the servants' quarters, the dining rooms, and even the far corners of Beverly Hills. By evening, the grand dining hall was packed with family, staff, and curious guests. They pretended to eat and talk, but their eyes were all on the center of the room, waiting for what was coming next. The chandeliers above shone bright, the silverware sparkled, and tension hung in the air like a thick fog. At the far end of the hall, Richard Montgomery entered slowly, using his cane to steady himself. On his arm was Evelyn, not in her usual maid's uniform, but in a simple navy dress, one Richard had picked out for her. The sight of her stunned the room into silence. Gasps echoed and forks clattered against plates. Victoria, sitting at the table, was stiff, her lips pressed tight like a stone. Daniel's face was unreadable, his jaw clenched in disbelief. Claire, with tears in her eyes, dabbed her face with a napkin, a soft look of pride crossing her face as she watched her father stand tall. Richard paused in the center of the table, his voice shaking but strong. "You all know Evelyn Brooks. For 12 years you've seen her work here, polishing floors, carrying trays none of you would touch." He paused, his hand squeezing Evelyn's gently. "But today, I want to tell you the truth. Evelyn is not just a servant. She is my mother." A wave of shock passed over the room. Some guests whispered, others scoffed in disbelief. Richard's eyes didn't leave his family. He looked at each one of them as he spoke. "She bled in silence so I could live a life of comfort. She carried a secret no woman should bear. And through it all, she was loyal to me. This house owes her more than gratitude. It owes her honor."
For the first time, Evelyn's chin lifted. She stood tall, not in the shadows, but in the light of her son's recognition. The garden outside the mansion glowed softly, the air filled with the sweet scent of wet earth and roses. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sense of calm, as though the house itself had taken a deep breath of relief. Richard sat at a small table in the garden, his cane resting against the chair. Evelyn sat beside him, wearing a simple cream shawl that fluttered gently in the evening breeze. Claire sat across from them, her hand resting over her father's, offering support in the quiet night. Daniel stood nearby, silent, lost in his own thoughts. Victoria stood at a distance, her face flushed with shame. She had lost everything, her place in the family, the life built on lies. But Richard had not banished her. He had simply stepped forward into the truth, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions. Richard turned to Evelyn, his voice thick with emotion. "For 31 years, I thought I knew who I was. But tonight, I stand free from all the lies. You are my mother, Evelyn, and I promise you that the world will know your name, not as a servant, but as the woman who gave me life." Evelyn's tears sparkled in the moonlight. She reached for his hand, her voice soft but strong. "And I promise you, my son, you will never face another storm alone." The garden fell silent, the only sound the gentle rustle of the leaves in the breeze. In that moment, dignity was restored, betrayal undone, and the truth finally triumphed.
If this story moved you, don't scroll past. Take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone you care about. Let them feel the power of love, sacrifice, and the truth that changed everything, because stories like this need to be heard.